So good afternoon, everybody. My name's Oldřich Bureš. I'm a professor of international security and conflict resolution at Metropolitan University Prague, and I have the pleasure of chairing this third panel titled Conflict Resolution and Peacebuilding. Before I introduce our distinguished speakers, I was asked to remind everybody that after we finish this panel and we hear a few closing remarks, there is a splendid international buffet. So please don't leave before you come to taste some of the delicious cuisine that has been prepared for this buffet. So please keep that in mind, also as a bonus to struggle with us in this third panel, which is always the difficult one, the last one in the afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome here four distinguished speakers. To my right, to the left, from your perspective, Augustin Nicolescou, head of the conflict transformation from the Austrian Study Centre for Peace and Conflict Resolution. Then also to your left is George Emile Irani, professor from American University of Kuwait. To my left and to your right, Rudi Sukandar, senior fellow at the Habibie Center and a senior lecturer at the London School of Public Relations in Jakarta, Indonesia. And then last but not least, someone whose name I will not mispronounce, at least, because it's a colleague from Charles University, Karel Čada. I will ask all of these speakers to deliver their remarks within roughly a 15-minute time limit so that we have enough time for the discussion, which I will then try to chair and moderate. We will follow the order as listed in the program, so if I can ask Augustin to go first. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Bureš. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure for me to be here with you today. I would like to thank the organizers on behalf of myself and Gudrun Kramer, the director of the Austrian Study Centre for Peace and Conflict Resolution. Unfortunately, she was scheduled to be here today, but she at the last minute was unable to attend and asked me to step in for her in my capacity as head of the ASPR's Conflict Transformation Unit and as a longtime colleague and collaborator. I'll be focusing on more of the long-term perspective. It has certainly been my experience that conflict transformation processes don't coincide very well with donor funding priorities and news cycles. Resources and international attention may be drawn to acute phases of conflicts, moments of rapid and violent escalation, although that, unfortunately, is not always the case. But most often, even when the eyes of the world are drawn to a conflict and serious efforts are undertaken to address the conflict, when those efforts don't succeed quickly or violence simply subsides, the conflict begins to be forgotten, neglected. They are relegated to the gray zone of frozen conflicts of neither war nor peace, but often a place of real suffering nonetheless. So it's all the more important for us to be ready to make a long-term commitment to conflict parties when they invite us to come in and help them in finding a sustainable and peaceful solution. But good intentions are not enough. We need to be aware that failure often comes at a cost and may be a blow against prospects for peace and reconciliation in the future. We favor the term conflict transformation in part because we wish to acknowledge that conflicts cannot be so easily resolved and be done with. Peace requires not only addressing those issues, but also changing attitudes, restoring positive relationships. Transforming conflicts, building peace, restoring trust which may never even have existed, those are long-term endeavors. It is a continuous process in the pursuit of positive peace, which Secretary General Bin Muammar mentioned in his opening speech this morning. Here in Prague, we have a beautiful vantage point to appreciate the extraordinary transformation of Europe, a transformation that started in the ashes of the Second World War and then a second transformation after the fall of the Iron Curtain and the reunification of Europe. Despite all the very serious challenges facing Europe and the European Union, the challenges of today are far preferable to the challenges of the past. The ASPR's home is Stadt Schleining, Austria. It was founded in the shadow of the Iron Curtain, which was passing just 12 kilometers to its east, as an appeal for peace. This history is a reminder that the peace we enjoy today cannot be taken for granted, that peace must be continuously renewed, and that we can and must do better still. Our work focuses on the long-term and ongoing processes of conflict transformation, the building of dialogue processes in protracted conflicts, and the fostering of reconciliation. In these efforts, education is a critical component. From the start, peace education has been at the core of what the Austrian Study Centre does. Its founder, Dr. Gerald Mader, described the goal of peace education as educating the next generation to become fully engaged citizens, able to engage in peaceful conflict resolution, and encouraging them to think critically. The best means of addressing violence is violence prevention and a culture of peace. Our efforts for peace education begin at home in Austria with children and youth from our own communities. Education is a lifelong process going beyond the formal educational system, but it's also part of that process as well. So every year, 2,000 school-aged children and young adults from elementary school to vocational school come to the ASPR and visit its home in the Peace Castle. They come with their classmates and teachers, and often at the start of the new school year, and it sets them on a path to a more cohesive and compassionate cohort in the years that follow. Over the course of a week, they learn to develop their competencies in situations of conflict, how to address conflicts constructively, skills for communicating nonviolently, mediating interpersonal disputes, and addressing the various forms of violence and absence of peace from the personal to the international level. It is about fostering a culture of peace and a narrative of peace, developing the awareness that conflict is an inevitable part of life, but that it can and should be addressed nonviolently, and in a way that ensures that the needs of all those involved are acknowledged and addressed. Ultimately, the programs seek to awaken and strengthen in the young participants a desire for and an attitude towards peace. In doing so, we plant the seeds for peace in the new generation to help change the culture towards one that is increasingly valuing peace and respects the human needs of all, not only as ideals, but also by concretely changing the institutions and structures so that they are more peaceful and just for everyone. Changing institutions and structures to become more peaceful means to address the injustices of those structures, which may marginalize and segregate and undermine the ability of certain groups, whether on the basis of origin, language, religion, culture, gender, socioeconomic class, from being able to fully participate, develop themselves, and succeed. At worst, those violent structures may target these groups for repression and physical violence, even genocide. The narrative that justifies the violence and the unjust structures need to be challenged. The implicit norms that the narrative perpetuates need to be made explicit and contested. This brings me to the work I and my colleagues have done with upcoming leaders, building their capacity to help them fulfill the potential they have begun to demonstrate in their communities. We have developed tailor-made programs for specific conflict contexts in order to enable upcoming leaders to engage in their societies, challenge conflict narratives which undermine peace, and constructively engage with and challenge the structures and institutions which impact their lives. These upcoming leaders are identified based on their desire and potential to influence and bring positive change to their communities. They're often young, in their 20s and 30s, but not always. They face the challenge of how to deal with the narrative that has emerged during the conflict, addressing the collective trauma brought on by violent conflict, and tackling the injustices perpetrated by the systems under which they live. Through their participation and engagement in their communities, they begin to develop alternatives to the narratives that continue to promote a negative conflict mentality, and alternatives for how institutions and social structures they live in negatively impact their lives and their potential for development. One such initiative I was part of was implemented by the German Development Agency, the GIZ, for Palestinian refugees from Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria, the 5 UNRWA fields. I wish Gudrun could be here today because she is really the mastermind of this program and was working for over 7 years at the GIZ in support of Palestinian refugees across the region. Over the course of 2 years, a group of 20 Palestinian refugees, upcoming potential leaders, participated in a university-accredited graduate-level program called Beyond. Course modules covered a range of interdisciplinary content. history, international relations, group dynamics and facilitation, working in traumatizing contexts, conflict transformation, project management. But in addition to this content, a strong focus was given to what we call process work. We had 4 facilitators which we brought in to help the participants deal with the numerous issues which naturally arose. Participants engaged in both facilitated and self-managed group discussions in different formats and settings, as well as one-on-one individual sessions. There was an extensive process of self-reflection in terms of their positions in their societies, as Palestinian refugees and as human beings. It was important for them to process and integrate the information and concepts presented, as well as what they learned from each other. This core group, in turn, used that knowledge and skills they gained back home in their own communities. Each participant formed their own multiplication group, with at least 10 participants who were also engaged for the duration of the 2-year period. The participants had to apply their facilitation and organization skills with these groups, tackling very difficult issues with them. The groups, in turn, had the task to create and implement their own community initiatives, for which they had a modest budget of a few thousand euros. The results were far beyond our expectations. A very diverse set of initiatives, many of which reached hundreds and even thousands of people in the community. Challenging the fact that refugee camps are not generally visited by non-refugees, one participant organized a market where local products could be sold and included shows and music. Several thousand people turned out for this event, along with high-ranking government officials and ministers. The group had to arrange for a venue, not an easy task inside a refugee camp. Find permits and arrange for the permits, learn how to engage with officials, convince private companies to participate. Most of them failed to respond, but later, afterwards, sent their apologies, regretting that they could not have been there, and promising that they would do better next time. Another initiative brought together Lebanese youth and Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, addressing the large divide between them. They visited each other, bringing Lebanese youth to a Palestinian refugee camp where they stayed overnight, which is a rather uncommon occurrence, and vice versa, also meeting with Lebanese and Palestinian officials. Some initiatives are still ongoing a year later, taken up by the communities in which they were implemented. In all, it would be conservative to say that the 20 initiatives ended up touching over 10,000 people, from 20 to 200 to over 10,000. A final component of this program was a South-South learning journey to Sri Lanka and a North-South learning journey to Germany. Traveling across Sri Lanka and seeing another reality there was an experience in itself. They saw the challenges faced by other communities who have endured conflict and how those communities organize themselves for collectively addressing the challenges they face, often without government or international assistance. They participated in a collective effort to refurbish a kindergarten in a small rural community. They met former combatants, struggling IDPs, and community leaders. The participants were exposed to a conflict which was not their own. And with that came the realization that the conflict there is not black and white, leading them to also reconsider their own conflicts and situation, and most importantly, what they themselves can do about it. During their learning journey to Berlin, they explored how the city has commemorated its past and deals with its history in order to create a new narrative of peace, made presentations at the university about the different realities faced by Palestinian refugees living across the region, discussed their own initiatives with ministry officials, and discussed regional issues with policy researchers. They got a better understanding of how to present themselves in an international context, and a better understanding of the international context as well. The result of all of this was a deeply transformative experience, certainly for the 20 participants, but also their multiplication group members and all those whom they encountered on this journey, myself included. The third approach I would like to share with you is our work with conflict parties as part of long-term initiatives. On this level, we engage with leaders and influential members of society with deep roots and broad networks. This is a level often referred to as track 1 and track 2, or most often a hybrid of the two, with official participants in their personal capacity rather than as representatives, a track 1.5. We find that there is a tendency to rush to the round table, to bring conflict parties together. The idea is that talking is better than fighting, but generally the fighting continues in the room itself. Generally not with blows, but definitely with words. Conflict parties may be willing to meet, but they may not be ready for a real dialogue. They have the natural human tendency to want to confront the other side, debate them, attempt to convince them the other of their own position. They're not ready to hear the other side, and in their presence are reluctant to re-examine their own positions and assumptions. That is human nature. They talk at each other, not with each other. Or they may be moderates who can find some agreement among themselves, but maybe not be supported by their own communities back home. Building a productive dialogue between opposing parties requires much more preparation with the conflict parties. Our task then, in the work that we do, is to help prepare them for genuine dialogue, accompanying them in this process. We work generally firstly with conflict parties separately, and we engage with those who might be called hardliners, but who are, however, open to looking for non-violent alternatives. This we did for 9 years in Sri Lanka, working in parallel with those from the government of Sri Lanka and the wider society on the one hand, as well as the political leadership of the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam on the other. For the past decade, we have worked continuously in Palestine, Israel, and the wider Holy Land, and more recently in the South Caucasus and Ukraine. The value of preparing conflict parties separately has become evident in our work. Often, conflict parties are themselves no longer clear on what they want to achieve and why. The focus is on the goal of defeating the other. We help them re-examine these assumptions, their narratives, and often they realize they need more information. So we support them in conducting research to gain a better factual understanding of issues and possible scenarios. If the present situation seems insurmountable, we explore the past and look at what could have been done differently, drawing on previous examples of coexistence and peace. We explore the narratives of each conflict party and find the good and peace-promoting examples from their own narratives. Each culture has narratives of peace and the non-violent resolution of differences. So no matter how brilliant a peace proposal looks on paper, it is worth little if the conflict parties and their societies think that it's a foreign construct. We need to find ways of rooting solutions in the cultures of the conflict parties. They must see themselves in these solutions. One small example from our work in the Holy Land, working with both influential religious Jews and Islamists, we see that the dominant approach to the conflict there is to seek an end of claims, a final status agreement, the deal of the century. We have found that this almost automatically excludes many, even most religious communities on both sides from supporting such an agreement. Who are we, they ask, to make decisions on the final status of God's holy land? It is not ours to decide. We must find a way to live together in the present, but the final status is not in our hands. So we seek formulations that take this into account, working to ensure that we respect the deep sensitivities and needs of each conflict party. And here there are many different conflict parties, not just two. We seek out the possibilities that will enable a just peace for all, respecting those needs and sensibilities. We also encourage conflict parties to put themselves in the position of the other so that they can begin to empathize with the other side, to understand the other side better, begin a process of rehumanizing the other, even as they continue to deeply disagree. When this becomes possible, when conflict parties have re-examined their own narratives and positions, engaged in self-reflection, studied the issues, understand the concerns of their own communities, explored alternatives, then we believe that real and constructive dialogue becomes possible, and the real work of restoring trust, fostering reconciliation, and building positive peace can begin in earnest. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution and sharing the experiences of the Austrian Study Centre for Peace and Conflict Resolution, especially highlighting the importance of peace education, learning about our own conflicts, their past, but also understanding other conflicts to understand our own conflicts. So I hope we can return to these themes in the discussion, but before we move to that, we will listen to the other remaining 3 presentations. So without further ado, Professor Irani, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, folks. I hope you're not too sleepy because of digestion. I'll try to make it brief and keep you awake, hopefully. First, I would like to thank, of course, the organizers of this conference, and also special thank to the Czech ambassador in Kuwait, I was at Martin Dvorak, and the chargé d'affaires there, Ms. Irina Guzachenko. They've been really very instrumental in getting me here. Prague, the city I love. Basically, this is a jewel for humanity. This is the first time I come here. That's one. Two, I'm surprised that the organizers, Czech Foreign Ministry, they could have basically digged into their history, especially recent history of the divorce between Czech and Slovakia. Done peacefully, not even one drop of blood shed. How did they do it? This is a lesson to share with humanity, by the way, folks. Why wasn't that considered? Anyway, you know, I'm always speaking outside of my pulpit here. Culturally speaking, when I'm asked who I am, I say I'm an Islamized Jewish Catholic. Islamized because I grew up in Lebanon, a Christian family, went to school, Christian school, but I had my buddies Muslims. I did not discover Islam until the age of 17, 16, 17, what the religion meant. Also, we studied the history of Islam, and also, don't forget, I studied Arabic literature. Most of the writers and poets were Muslims, of course. We have our great Christian Arab writers, Khalil Gibran, the famous Yazidis, all the role that the Arab Christians have played and still play, even if they are being today in a very bad situation, folks. In Iraq, very few of them left. Palestine, they are also under siege. Syria, you know the story. And Iraq, the same deal. Catholic, because I grew up in a Maronite Christian family. I'm a relapsed Catholic, meaning relax, not relapsed, relaxed. I like this Pope, Francis, but I'm not a churchgoer. My first ex-wife was Jewish, married her 5 years. I mention her in my book, Sarah Rebecca Feinbaum. She came to Lebanon, by the way, to my sister's wedding in 1980. My mom, bless her heart, passed away. She offered her gifts and gold and stuff like that. And my second wife was also American. I'm an American citizen too. I pay my taxes to Uncle Sam, not to Uncle Donald. And I'm glad Donald was beaten yesterday, the House. Anyway, so so basically that's a couple of things I wanted to share with you. The other thing, folks, as an academic, about definitions. When we talk about peace, what do we mean peace, folks? Basically in Arabic, there are two words, salam, sulh and salam. My Muslim brothers and sisters here know about the sulh of Hudaybiyah, when the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, I say it, my friend, I'm a Christian, okay? He had a 10 years truce, right, in Mecca. So that was sulh, then after he went back to war. The same deal happened when Sadat signed the peace treaty with Israel. Many newspapers in Egypt called it sulh, not salam. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. Because salam and shalom, by the way, folks, come from the same root, is a higher level of peace and nonviolence and so on and so forth. Number three, folks, and I always tell this my students in my conflict resolution classes, that conflict is not bad, folks. Conflict is not bad, because conflict brings positive relationships, rethinking, changes, and so on. By the way, folks, Czech-Slovak conflict, look what happened. You have a peaceful relationship between that. Last but not least, the issue of the wording, conflict resolution. By the way, folks, not all conflicts can be resolved. Okay, now today we have a cold peace between Egypt and Israel, for instance, or Turkey and Greece. We have programs in conflict management. I was teacher of the program in Canada, it was conflict management. We have programs in conflict prevention. So in a sense, with all due respect to my friends and colleagues at Harvard and other places, they try to impose their views, their terminology on others. This is why it's a very important book, folks. I'm not plugging it. It's called Creating the Third Force, Indigenous Processes of Peacemaking. It goes all the way to the Maoris and how indigenous people deal with their conflict. Here I come to this topic. I try to be brief. The difference between Western approaches to conflict resolution and Arab Islamic approaches. I'll try to be brief. I want to talk about a brief experience in Lebanon. Number one, the difference is that in the West, the primacy is on the individual. Okay, individual choice. Okay, in the process. Individuals are free agents. Remember that, folks? Goes all the way back to the French Revolution, to the liberal age, John Locke, and so on and so forth. This also leads me to another important difference, folks, is the issue of separating religion from politics. Deen wa dawla. No one talks about that, folks. It's crucial. The Europeans went through a 30 years war, bloody war, including this place, by the way, was yesterday Cathedral Vitus Mitus. We're talking about that, with all due respect, Jan Hus and so on and so forth. Lots of blood was shed to separate, tell the Pope stay in Rome and leave us alone. So far, we don't have this in the Middle East, the Arab world. We don't have a separation between deen and dawla, and I talk about this with my students. Usually what happens, folks, is that mediation or arbitration services in the West are provided by formally certified facilitators, usually lawyers, mediators, and so on. In the Arab Islamic world, basically, is the community that legitimizes that. I am talking here about specific instances. All right, keep in mind, folks, that there are 3 types of laws in the Arab Islamic world. Sharia, Western laws, British or French, 3 tribal laws. So, folks, this doesn't make life easy for creating a sense of citizenship. That's what I was talking to my sister this morning from Lebanon. In Lebanon, we do not have citizens. We have a conglomerate of people that are unified by their leader, by their community, and even that. So the Christians today of Lebanon are split in 10,000 groups, Muslims and so on and so forth, to the chagrin of our ambassador in Czechia. The other thing, folks, is in order to reach reconciliation, there are important steps to take. And this is part of one of the theory I worked on. One, the first step is the process of acknowledgement. Okay, we acknowledge that something bad has happened. Okay, like for instance, the church's acknowledgement to what basically the Crusades did in the Middle East. And by the way, the Crusades, people still talk about them in the Middle East, by the way, in Syria, Lebanon, and so on. Al-Hurub al-Salibiyya, the Crusaders' War. People still today also talk about what happened in Latin America, folks. You know, Catholic missionaries sent by the church to civilize those barbarians. You remember the famous Mission Civilisatrice. Okay, Edward Said talks about that in his book Orientalism. So acknowledgement. Acknowledgement followed by apology. It is crucial, folks, to apologize. Okay? And that's what the Australians did with the indigenous they have, the Aboriginals. That's what the Canadian recently Trudeau did with his own people in the First Nations of Canada. There was an apology. Okay? Following apology is compensation. This is very important, folks. Compensation can be moral and can be material. Okay? And basically, this doesn't lead automatically to forgiveness and reconciliation. Even if forgiveness is a Western concept, by the way, folks, it's not a non-Western concept, okay? And reconciliation is the last of the trail. Example, folks, Germany and Israel. Germany has already given Israel more, I don't know, $70 billion since World War II, compensation what happened during the Holocaust. Did Israel forgive Germany? No, senor. Until now, no. Because in Judaism, you have 2 conceptions about forgiveness. The Orthodox Jews tell you that only God forgives. The Reformed Jews say, no, only the dead forgive. There's an excellent book by Simon Wiesenthal called The Sunflower. He talks about when he was in a concentration camp in Poland, there was a Nazi Catholic soldier on his deathbed. He asked the nun, he told her, can you bring a Jew? I want to seek forgiveness. I'm a Catholic. Wiesenthal came, and the Nazi soldier told him, I would like you to forgive me. Wiesenthal replied, I cannot speak on behalf of the dead. So that's very important. The other important thing, folks, to keep in mind when we talk about non-Western cultures and Arab Islamic cultures is the issue of honor, sharaf. This is very important, folks. Okay, honor is crucial. Face-saving. This was the issue, for instance, when Anwar Sadat, waged that war in 1973. Remember the October War? It was basically to regain Egypt's lost honor after 1967 and defeat under Gamal Abdel Nasser. Honor, face, dignity is very important, prestige, just compensation and respect for individuals and groups. This is very important, folks, keeping in mind that most of these Middle Eastern societies, I don't want to be essentialist here, are basically befuddled by or burdened by the issue of patriarchy, okay? And things are changing, folks. I can tell you, for instance, in Kuwait, where I've been living for the last 10 years, they have the highest amount of divorces in the world, folks, in the world. Every day there are more than 22 divorces in Kuwait. Kuwaiti women are tough broads, big time. Okay, so Kuwaiti males are so scarce, so they go to Morocco to find brides there, Morocco. All due respect to Moroccan ladies. So basically, that's something to keep in mind. So honor, face-saving, prestige is very important. All this related to male men, perception of themselves. It's a powerful book by Jumana Haddad, who a couple of years ago wrote, Superman is an Arab. I don't know if you saw that. I urge you to check it out. Okay, and the second book she wrote was I Killed Shahrazad. You know the story of Shahrazad, folks. I won't go there. Okay. Coming to my own personal work, a few years ago, got a grant from the Swiss government and the State Department to do reconciliation work in Mount Lebanon, in the areas where you had displacement, in the Druze villages, where many Christians were displaced because the Christian militias at that time, Mr. Jaja and his crowd, the Lebanese forces, went to the Druze villages in the mountains, and they committed massacres. Okay? So the Druze, of course, took their revenge, and many Christians were forced out. Okay? After the war ended, they created, the so-called Lebanese government created the Ministry for the Affairs of the Displaced. Okay? So what happened? This ministry became a big trough. You know what is a trough? That you bring for cows and donkeys to eat. So it became a big trough to dip in, take money, and use it for patronage purposes. So today, only 20–30% of the displaced Christians went back to their villages, initial villages. So we worked with 3 villages. One is the village of Salima. The other one, the village of Farmata. And the third one is the village of Brih. What we did was a colleague of mine in Washington. We basically, what we did first, we did an intra-community dialogue. So we brought the Druze together, and we asked them, what do you want to do to get the Christians back? What will you do? What kind of steps, you know, what kind of confidence-building measures are you willing to do to encourage them to come back? The second step was an intra-community dialogue with the Christian communities that were displaced. Same story. What confidence-building measures should the Druze take to make you trust them and go back to your villages? And then we did the intra-community dialogues. In a sense, it's based on the famous theory, my colleague here knows about it, by Jean-Paul Lederach, one of the grandfathers of the field, who talked about the top-down, bottom-up approach to conflict resolution. And this is the tragedy we have in the Middle East today, folks, because all the peace treaties, Camp David, Oslo, and so on and so forth, are from the top. Top-down, bottom-up. Very few Egyptians have visited Israel, folks, okay, while many Israelis visited Egypt, Jordanians ditto. So basically, trust is not there. So you have to do this mixture of bottom-up, top-down to try to enhance the relationship. What happened is basically, I'm going back now for Christmas to find out an update. I'm presenting a paper next March at the International Study Association to update what happened with these 3 villages. Some people went back, some did not. And basically, which is very important, folks, many of these people who went through sham reconciliation feasts or whatever were all organized by the top. So you had the Maronite patriarch showing up. You had the Druze warlord, Walid Jumblat, showing up. They used it for their own political purposes. While I was in a taxi last week in Beirut, he told me, we were talking about the reconciliation, the Shuf Mountains. He said in Arabic, Druze والمسيحيين والموارنة صالين على بعضهم. Salin is like dogs and cats. You know dogs and cats, when they look at each other, that's the deal today, meaning there is no trust between the Christians and the Druze. So these are some of the things, folks, to keep in mind when we're trying to talk about reconciliation, acknowledging the other, non-other, and so on and so forth. Because basically, folks, in this whole story, as I said this morning, we have today ignoring the other in Hungary, in Poland, in Italy. Oh my God, the statements made by the Italian foreign minister. Italy, Poland, countries that give refugees, sent refugees all the way back to the United States of America in the early part of the 19th century, folks. Today they're shutting their borders. That's acknowledging the other folks? No. Donald Trump, I'm glad yesterday the Democrats got back the House, but still he has a Senate. Donald Trump, land of the free, home of the brave, Statue of Liberty in New York, give me your masses and so on and so forth. Where is it? Where does it go? Okay, we're sending troops to the border of Mexico to keep them out and whatever, all politicizing this whole story. And last but not least, what happened to Egyptians in the Copts in Cairo a few days ago, and what's happening to other places too. So basically what I wanted to say is this. I'm not saying there is a divide between the West and East. We are all human beings, folks. We are all human beings living on this planet that we are messing up big time, folks. You saw the latest report of the environmental disaster that is waiting for us, okay? We're taking everybody else for granted. We cannot, okay? And I live, by the way, the interfaith dialogue and interreligious dialogue and the cultural dialogue every day when I teach, folks. We have 2,400 students in the American University of Kuwait, majority Muslims, by the way. 70% are Muslims. And I tell them these things, by the way, and they accept that. So I have, you know, an interaction with them. Plus, we forget to say something very important. The Emir of Kuwait, okay? His Highness basically was recently, last year, was appointed as the leader of humanity in, you know, peacekeeping in the world, okay? And that's very important, keep that in mind. By the way, Kuwait has 400,000 Christians, okay? 5 families, Christian families, and there are 5 churches, folks. No one knows about that, all right? Of course, the Abu Dhabi, Dubai, also they have their own Christians. What I'm saying is that in Kuwait, Christians can worship every Friday. They go to their churches and they pray, okay? Of course, they cannot show the cross outside the church, but they can go and pray in peace and so on. I know time is up. Thank you for your attention. I hope I created some thought. 1 minute, please. Yes, you can have it, man, with a cup of whiskey. Thank you, folks. Wassalamu alaikum.
Yes, thank you, Professor Irani, for these remarks and the reminders about the differences between Western and Middle Eastern or Islamic approaches to conflict resolution, going perhaps as deep down as the very terminology that we use. Again, something that we can hopefully return to in the Q&A session. Now, if I may, we will move to Rudi Sukandar, who I believe has a PowerPoint presentation, so hopefully the technology will not fail us. So I'll try to help with that. So please, the floor is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're still awake, the late hours of the day, but we'll get something to look forward to have dinner after this session. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference and also the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Indonesian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to have me here, sharing Indonesian experience on conflict resolutions and peace building. Just to put things into context, then I would like to just show you a couple of pictures. The first one, if you're not really sure where Indonesia is, and that's where it is. So it is in Southeast Asia. It has, what we call as, jokingly as dangerously beautiful, because we have survived volcano eruptions. due to being in the ring of fire. And then we survive earthquakes and tsunami due to being in a very active tectonic plates. And also we survived terrorist attacks several times. And also we survived several communal conflict. So as you can see that, because of that, then several countries issued travel warning to Indonesia. So because of that, then some non-state actors in Indonesia think that we need to send message to the world that to campaign against the travel warning on Indonesia. So that's why that is actually a tongue-in-cheek way of saying that having a tagline, travel warning, Indonesia, dangerously beautiful. So please do visit us. Now, if we take a look at that, looking into the map, then we can see that Indonesia, an archipelago. If I may, then I would just like share with you how diverse we are. Well, the last count say that we have more than 17,500 islands, and then we have about 300 ethnic groups with 1,340 sub-ethnic groups, speaking 1,211 local languages and dialects. So if you think that you can find any other countries that can match how diverse Indonesia is, then I might need to, to take a look into the competitions again about how diverse we are. And also we have 6 major religions plus several other local religions that have survived in Indonesia for the past years. Now, based on that, we can see that, which is quite interesting, that a scholar on Indonesia was baffled with the existence of Indonesia as a state, because he said that, looking at the facts that I mentioned to you, that Indonesia is not ideal to be a state because of being too diverse and being too spread out on the 17,000 islands. And yet we are here 73 years after our independence, overcoming our crisis and then challenges, and then because we believe in unity in diversity. So based on that, then we can see that it's not always an easy road for Indonesia to be as we are today. There has been a long and winding roads. There's a lot of obstacles along the way, and I would like to share you something that are not rosy in Indonesian perspective. Especially today, we are looking at into cultural and identity conflict, identity-based conflict. Here is the data that my institution has based on the National Violence Monitoring System. So we monitored 34 provinces in Indonesia, looking at into the occurrences of identity-based conflict, among others. So as we can see that, I have to apologize first, and I need to mention to you that I forgot to put a line actually separating each period of the data, because it has 6 periods of data. The first one in 1997, it covers only 1 province. 1998 until 2004, the database covered 9 provinces. 2005 and 2011, it covered 16 provinces. 2012 and 2013, it covered 18 provinces. And 2014, if you take a look at the search, there is not really a search because we covered all provinces in Indonesia, 34 provinces. And then 2015, since there was a problem in data collection and so on, then the data updated, the last updated was in March 2015. Now, as you can see that we are also facing a lot of conflict based on identity. Identity that I mentioned here can be in the forms of ethnicity, religion, geography, sports club affiliation too, and school students brawl, fighting among themselves, that also are included in the data that we have. As you can see that we have about, especially in 2014, for example, we have about 800 incidents of violence that happens between groups. That also include, because that was the year of the elections, there was some conflict based on political affiliation too. Now, as you can see that it is really, really not easy for Indonesia to maintain our unity and resolve our the conflict that we have among ourselves. As you can see that I only put only one type of conflict that we have, that is identity-based conflict. We got a lot of more, but I'm not sure that the time is enough to cover everything. Now, so I would like to continue with some highlights that we have done so far, especially in conflict resolution. The first one, based on several communal conflict that we have two kinds of initiative. The first one is government-based initiatives in resolving communal conflict in Indonesia. The first one is Malino Agreement in 2001, is to resolve sectarian conflict in Poso, in Sulawesi, between the Muslims and the Christians. And the second one is Malino Agreement 2 in 2002, that resolved the sectarian conflict between Muslims and also Christians in Maluku's island. So after that, then besides the government-based initiative, we also have community-based initiative. This is partly to answer some points that was mentioned in the first session today about the role of women, and also about mediation when government doesn't support. I believe this from Ms. Tamimova this morning, and also from Ms. Aldorf about the roles of women in mediation. Now, some of the initiatives that we had is something that we call as peace provocateurs. Peace provocateurs are those people who like to help people maintain peace in previously conflict areas, especially in the Moluccan Islands. So there are young people who work together regardless of their ethnicity and their religious beliefs. For example, they work together and try to promote peace. So besides, we have provocators, conflict provocators, and they just want to make sure that they have a counter narrative to that by labeling themselves as peace provocateurs. The next one is also based on the conflict in Maluku too, between the Muslims and the Christians. Then there is the creations of meeting points. So this is a very, very informal way of resolving conflicts, in which I would like to give credits to women here, because they created a space, a venue for them, as in a traditional market where people from two conflicting areas can meet, have their business, having the business transactions, selling and buying things, but at the same time they also start to build a post-conflict communication. And then the next one is taken from an example that we had on an ethnic conflict that happens in my home province in Central Kalimantan between the local and the migrant ethnic groups. So because the migrants were forced to leave the province, then they wanted to come back to the area. They want to come back to their home province because they were born there, but they were labeled as migrants because of their ethnicity, coming from a different island. So after sending waves of negotiators to meet the local people, then all of them were rejected. Not even before they set foot on the province, because they were men. Men were considered as threats. So the local people did not allow any male negotiators to negotiate on the return of the refugees. So the refugees, after that, came up with an indigenous, not really indigenous actually, but a very strategic move by sending a female negotiator to negotiate the return of the refugees. Now, female in those provinces were not considered as threats, so they were successfully negotiating with the local people and return the refugees back to their province. So as you can see that here we can find that government-based initiative and also community-based initiative can go hand in hand, especially when we want to resolve a conflict and also we want to build peace. The next one is, actually should be, well, anyway. After that, then we just look into how institutional capacity in conflict management. Well, the World Bank in 2011 defined capacity as the ability of institutions to carry out their core functions efficiently and effectively. So based on that, then Indonesian scholars try to define what institutional capacity in conflict prevention that covers institutionalizations of conflict prevention, identifications of conflict potentials, knowledge management on conflict preventions, and strategy designing of conflict prevention based on issues, as well as action of conflict prevention. Why is conflict prevention is important? It's because in 2012, the government of Indonesia and the lawmakers in Indonesia introduced the Law 7, 2012 about social conflict management. Indonesia is quite unique in some ways because we divide disasters. When you're talking about crisis management, we divide disasters into two. The first one is natural disasters, as I mentioned to you, earthquake, tsunami, a volcano eruption, and so on. And the second one is what we call a social disaster. Social disasters involves the whole definitions about conflict and communal, and also some violence that happen. Now, according to the Article 4 of the law, it says that conflict management includes conflict prevention, conflict cessation, and post-conflict rehabilitation. I'm just going to focus on the conflict preventions because that's the things that we have been working a lot on so far. Now, as you can see that preventing conflict, according to Article 2.2, Article 6.2, preventing conflict is the responsibilities of the government, regional government, and society. So in preventing conflict, government and non-government institutions will maintain peaceful condition in the society, develop peaceful dispute resolution, reducing conflict potentials, and build an early warning system. Now, how do we do this? I divide that into two, in terms of the approaches to conflict preventions based on Indonesia experience, then I just divide that into two approaches. The first one is securitized approaches. This is what we do, we have done so far, using the institutional coordination within government and non-government institutions. We have very active civil society organizations in Indonesia who help the government and help the society to maintain peace and also try to work on conflict prevention. The next one is the creations of forum for dialogues. The government of Indonesia has helped establish what we call as Community Early Warning Forum. This is a forum where all leaders in the society can work together to look into how we can build an early warning, especially when there is a potential of conflict that might occur in certain areas. So by doing this, so then the government, also especially the government apparatus, the state apparatus, for example, can be ready whenever a potentials of violence happens. And the next forum that was used is what is called as Interreligious Harmony Forum. This is also the government-sponsored institution, and it goes all the way from the province to the level of sub-district. So in a village level, then we have this forum where all religious leaders in the area work together, trying to, help the society in bridging differences and try to, solve some problems that might happen and also that have happened in the community. So that way, then we can always maintain this, communication between the leaders of religious groups in Indonesia. The next one is about the buildings of early warning systems. We have this government institution because they have network structures and mechanism. Based on our research that we did in several provinces in Indonesia, for example, one of the method that they used was actually using the text messages that will go directly in chain to the top level of the provincial leaders, for example, so they can come up with quite reliable information about something that can potentially create a violent conflict in a community. The next one is also using the non-government institution using their internal network mechanism in media. We are blessed with the freedom of speech in Indonesia, especially with the media, so we can always find some reports openly stating about what is really happening in one area. The next one is alternative dispute resolution. We use what we call as local customary practices and tradition. Mr. Darmadi in the second session talked about the adat or how the local people can resolve their problems and differences without having to involve the government or the state apparatus. And the next one, also following our culture, then we have this concept that what we call a musyawara is a persuasion through consultation, which is quite interestingly because it is adopted as a way of decision making in Association of Southeast Asian Countries, where Indonesia is a member. And the second part is non-securitized approaches. One of the things that we have done so far involving the civil society organization is the strengthening social cohesion. It has become a big issue in Indonesia with the coming of the elections, with the divisions of the society into political, according to political affiliation, and also about the spread of hoaxes. I'll be talking about that tomorrow, I think. Yeah, and that probably is some of the biggest concern that we have. The next one is building tolerance among the youth. This is a very important point because in 2016 World Peace Forum in Jakarta, one of the points in the communique that was stated there was that we need to communicate with the youth, especially when you're dealing with counter-violent extremism. And again, many Indonesian civil society organizations has been working on this, both using the technology and also using the conventional ways of spreading the tolerance in Indonesia. And the last, and but not least, communicating with the youth. This is also one way, part of that, the point in the World Peace Forum that I mentioned to you, that because we admit that we have problems communicating with young people. They speak different languages, different ways of, not different languages, different ways of saying things that sometimes that the older generations don't understand what they want. And also the older generation just have this difficulty in trying to send their messages because they don't know how to communicate with the young people. This is also one of the biggest homework that we need to do, especially if we want to, to help build a more peaceful Indonesia in the future. With that, I just close my presentation. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much for sharing with us the experiences and approaches to conflict prevention in Indonesia. There were many interesting issues. I would be, for example, really interested to hear more about these peace provocateurs if we have time in the Q&A session. But now let's move to our last, but not the least, presenter, Karel Čada. So the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me here. So first, I have to say that my background is in sociology, and as a sociologist I am pretty innocent in terms of international relations. So for me, I think that this experience is a bit quite refreshing and very much inspirational, but also I feel a bit strange that I will not fit into the scheme of the panel. But as a sociologist, I am generally interested in the issues as a migration, racism, hate crime and hate speech, and civil society. So, and with regard to this field, I see many overlapping areas between sociology of these particular fields and the issues of international relations / conflict resolution or peace building. So, and what I would like just to present today is some kind of remarks on a larger project on Islamophobia in six European countries, and also as some kind of applied product of this project, which is the Counter Islamophobia Kit. So first of all, I think there's a question why it's so important to deal with Islamophobia in recent Europe. For us, there are two main issues. One issue that especially in countries with a strong Muslim presence, the Islamophobia is one of the biggest obstacles for people, for Muslims to express this Muslimness, and also in the consequences something what exclude them from public life, from public spaces. The situation is slightly different in countries like the Czech Republic or Hungary, with a much less number of Muslims, with not so much visible Muslim presence, but we see Islamophobia discourse and Islamophobia rhetoric as a strong obstacle for open dialogue and open discussion on issues as a migration, on so-called refugee crisis, and also some kind of a limitation for discussing of some kind of causes or solution. For these reasons, I think this is something which was originally as a background of the research project. The research project was supported by European Commission in this program or scheme action, and the leader of the project was the University of Leeds, and 8 European Union member states were involved in. So on one hand there was France, Germany, Belgium and the UK, like 4 countries with very big numbers of Muslims and very long experience with Islamophobia, with living with the Muslim minorities. And these 2 countries were just, these 4 countries were just involve any other 4 countries, like peripheral countries like the Czech Republic, Hungary, Portugal and Greece. So the comparison between the 2 benches of countries, and also countries with completely different culture, like Hungary on Czech Republic on one side, the UK on the other side, Greece on that side. So it just provides at us some kind of a very rich material for comparison and some kind of identification of different patterns of Islamophobia in Europe. So I think that can easily see what is a quite common patterns for all countries, but also how different patterns are so much dependent on cultural, historical or sociological or social conditions in different countries. So the first step was some kind of identification of most popular, most salient Islamophobic anti-Muslim narrative, and the second step was just the identification of counter-narratives, how this narrative, how Islamophobia could be faced, how be challenged. So, and in the end, I think that's the Counter Islamophobia toolkit also contains some kind of examples of best practices which were identified in this 8 countries. So, and there are key messages, and the messages are aimed both at the national state and the European level. What I think that's quite symptomatic, and it's something a part of our experience, that when we had the launch of this Counter Islamophobia kit in a European Parliament, so it was quite visible that it's not something, or Islamophobia or anti-Islamophobia politics, something what can be associated with one spectrum of the parties, because this launch event was organized 3 British members of the Parliament, 1 from the Green Party, 1 from the Labour, 1 from the Conservative. So it's not something which is a right-wing or left-wing or progressive, but it's something what goes across the political spectrum. If we can see the dominant Islamophobic narratives, and now I focus mostly on the Czech Republic, and also just try to bit underline some aspects when the Czech Republic is different from the rest of the country. So there is two things. The first is a narrative of radicalization, so there is some kind of a very strong security imperative, and the second one is a narrative what we call the fate multiculturalism narrative, like a narrative of a felt integration. So in these terms, and in the European comparison, the Czech Islamophobia lies somewhere in between French discourse, which is very much security oriented, and a German discourse, which is oriented much more in terms of integration. So another thing which is, and this is and the third point, which is quite important, and I will speak about it later, is a slippery slope narrative. What is quite symptomatic for the Czech Republic, that the Czech Republic, there is a really small numbers of Muslims. There are approximately 20,000 Muslims living in the Czech Republic. So when we speak about Islamophobia in the Czech Republic, and also when we speak about Islamophobia in Hungary, for example, we speak about Islamophobia without Muslims. So what we follow, there is a very strong discourse, what we can see on the internet, on news media, on social media, which is pretty much Islamophobic, but they are not Muslims in the Czech Republic. This is one thing. And the second quite important thing, that's, for example, in comparison with a much more religious country, the Czech Islamophobia is much more secular oriented. It's not like a religion against different religion, or like, for example, what we can see now in Hungary, that Islamophobic rhetorics in Hungary is pretty much like that Hungary is a Christian country, like a last bastion of Christianity against Muslims invasion. It is nothing present in the Czech Republic. It's much more like a discussion, like a religion and a secular state. The last thing which is quite important, or just quite different in the Czech Republic, is a seven narrative, which is something what we call Muslims as a gypsies narrative, and is a way that the Islamophobia is something that the Islamophobia Czech Republic follows up the different rhetoric of racism. So it's just one source of Islamophobia is a previous anti-Roma, anti-Gypsy racism in a Czech society, and also there is a much more association between Muslims and Roma in terms of their physical appearance, and also different culture and adaptability and stuff. So what we can see, and this is one of the issue how this hate speeches are different in Europe, that in some way they just follow up the previous racism and respect them, or just adopt them into the new rhetoric. So in terms of the key finding and key lessons, so one is the widespread security risk and the danger to democratic societies and integration, and the key role is played by what we call the slippery slope narrative. We just borrow the term slippery slope from discussion in biomedicine, in issues like euthanasia, for example, and the slippery slope meaning that if we do the first steps, they will immediately follow the next and next steps. So when we just, for example, allow Muslim community to build a cemetery in the Prague, so one of the member of one of Prague municipality, so she thought, okay, when we build a cemetery, we will focus much on demands, and we inevitably end up like a Marseille with no-go zone. So the core of the narrative of Islamophobia in the countries where there are no Muslims is like a threat that the small steps now will just emerge or emulate in a catastrophe in the next couple of years. So this is one thing. The second thing is some kind of a duality of normalization of Islamophobia. Then when you speak with many people, they just consider to be Islamophobic something that's very normal, that is quite usual to have a fear of Muslims and stuff like that. So and also Islam is very much portrayed something as a very much exotic, very much which is a very dramatic, which is something what is connected with the image of violence or brutality. So, and in terms of the counter narrative, there is two interconnected steps necessary. One is the denormalization of Islamophobia, to say it is not normal to be Islamophobic. For example, we can see in different countries, for example, I think that 3 years ago in Australia, there was a big campaign on Twitter that people just expressed their solidarity with Muslims as victims of victims hate crimes. They say, okay, we know there are terrorist attacks, there are radical community, but we know that this is not something which is inherently associated with Islam, and we know there are lots of normal Muslims living among us people like we are. And the second thing is a normalization of Islam. That's when we just did some kind of a media analysis, it was a very much dramatic pictures of Islam. What we need is a much less dramatic pictures like Muslim fashion, Muslim celebrities, really everyday life in Muslim communities. And also it's necessary to see Muslims in different roles. For example, in soap operas, like that some character might be, for example, nurse, and what character is nurse, and just the Muslimness is something which is like a associated character. It's not something which is a. And the last thing is that it's necessary to keep discussing Islamophobia and migration separately. That we can be tolerated, that there are different opinions and different attitudes towards, for example, migration policies. Someone is much more for restrictive measure, someone is much more for liberal measure, but on the other hand, there are aspects of patterns of speeches which cannot be accepted. In terms of very much practical steps, we see some kind of a need for multidisciplinary teams for communication. That's I think that across the Europe, if we want to communicate or just to challenge effectively Islamophobia or hate speech in general, there needs a cooperation of experts of religion, experts of culture, with psychologists, sociologists, people deal with the communication. Because one expertise is not enough, and there is a need for some kind of a multiplicity expertise on collaboration across the discipline. This is something what anti-racism on anti-racism movement, I think that should take a lesson from climate change and from climate change communication, at least in the expert field. So, and another thing is just taking lesson from populists. We just see that there's a range of different populist parties, of different populist politicians, who are terribly successful. So we need to understand why they are successful, and just to try to use their weapons or just to react on their rhetoric. And also very important is the breaking of social bubbles. In many practical steps, is something what missing still in Czech Republic is just some kind of regular mapping and documents Islamophobia and periodically reports on Islamophobia. And the last thing, and where I see that there might be really big room for inspiration from conflict resolution or from peace building, is just to implement programs based upon experiential learning as a part of multicultural education. Now what we know exactly that just frontal teaching or just reading is not enough. We need to implement some kind of particle part of experience into the curricula, how to tackle the stereotypes, how to live in a diverse society. So it was probably my last slide and my last remark, and thank you for this. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for bringing the discussion back to the Czech land, so to speak, and sharing with us both the Islamophobic narratives and how to counter them. This has concluded the presentations in our panel, but now finally I can give the floor to questions, comments from the audience. So if you could identify yourself by waving your hand or otherwise catch my attention. If you want to ask a question, please also briefly introduce yourself. And once you pose the question, if you can specify whom you want to answer that question among the 4 panelists, that would be great. So questions, comments, please. Don't hesitate. looking around and I don't see any hands. So second, over there, please.
Thank you very much. My question goes to Karel Čada. You were, on your last slide, you were saying lessons from the populists. I would like you to be more specific on this, because if we agree that there is the tendency to, let's say, reimagine our communities, our societies as non-diverse, as homogeneous, based on whatever imagined narratives, and if this is the foreground of a narrative or mobilization on populism, does really, like, lessons learned and using the same tools, is that helpful, or are you thinking in different directions? Thanks.
Thank you for your question. For us, I think that's when we look at the Czech populism, and also when we look at the studies written by, for example, American sociologists about Trump's popularity, there's one important aspect that's especially in the Czech Republic, that they are one of the, for example, Czech populist named Tomio Okamura, and the guy before election, he traveled from one town to another town and from one village to another village, and he spoke directly with people. And what is important, it's not like that he gave people voice, but he gave people illusion that someone listened to them. And it's exactly what the American sociologist writes about a movement, or firstly like a Tea Party and after Trump, that in somehow a movement like that gave people illusion that someone listened to them. And this is an important aspect, that people, they just feel that nobody listened to them, and also the part of this tackling of racism is just to take some kind of a threats, some kind of fear seriously, just try to, in some kind of a dialogue, to look for causes, what is behind it, and just try to say, okay, for example, I think that if we just agree that Islamophobia or racism is a product, some kind of insecurities about future, insecurities about economic situation, so just try to tackle directly these roots. But the necessary is just to step down to people. You know, like in terms of the populism, it's a bit like what one of the inspiration is going back to people, which doesn't mean in like a negative term, but also like a positive movement. I think in answer like a very nutshell.
Thank you. Other questions? No questions. Last call for questions. I take it as a sign that everybody is looking forward very much to the intercultural buffet and that you want to continue your discussions over the food that will be served there. On that note, let me thank you all for panelists once again for their contributions. I believe now we will have some closing remarks from the conference organizers, so if you can remain in your seats, there will be a few more farewell remarks, and then we can proceed to the intercultural buffet. So thank you very much for this panel, and please stay seated for the closing remarks.